In the late autumn of 1822, in the damp wooded valleys of the Ohio frontier, the darkness came early and stayed late. The light that fought it was a feeble thing, a sputtering, greasy flame that smelled of rendered fat and failure. Inside the Calloway cabin, the air was thick, carrying a film of soot that coated every surface. Clinging to the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling and the precious few panes of glass in the windows. Josiah Calloway, a man of 30, with the calloused hands of a tinsmith and the precise, worried eyes of a man who hated waste, watched the light. He sat at his simple plank table, watching his wife Elara squint as she tried to pull a needle through thick homespun. Her face, young but already etched with the strain, was illuminated in brief, flickering bursts. Beside her, their 2 children, a boy and a girl, tried to sound out words from a shared primer, their heads bent so close to the Betty lamp that their hair seemed to risk catching fire. The lamp itself was the problem. It was a simple, shallow tin dish, a slut, as some called it, with a twisted rag for a wick that lay in a pool of cooling lard. The flame was a lazy yellow-orange teardrop, casting more shadow than light, giving off a constant, sickly plume of black smoke. Josiah felt a familiar tightness in his chest. This was not just inconvenience, it was a theft. The darkness stole the most valuable thing they had, the working hours of the evening. It stole the children's education. It stole Elara's eyesight and the cost. He calculated it in his head, as he did every night. The amount of precious rendered fat that lamp consumed, turning it not into light, but into noxious smoke and a greasy film on the walls, was offensive. He had built his cabin tight. He had caulked the seams with oakum and clay. He had split his shingles to a perfect thickness. His hearth drew clean and true, pulling its own smoke straight up into the cold night air. He was a man who understood design, who understood that the difference between survival and misery was in the details. And this lamp, this accepted universal tool, was, he had decided, a profound and elemental failure. He picked up another, identical lamp, and held it near the primer. The light barely doubled. It just produced more smoke. He looked at the weak orange circle it cast on the table, a circle no bigger than a dinner plate, and felt an engineer's frustration. He didn't just want more light. He wanted better light. He wanted a flame that burned clean, that consumed its fuel completely, that turned fat into illumination, not filth. He looked back at the window, where the grime from the lamp smoke was so thick he could draw a line through it with his fingernail. Outside, the moon on the thin crust of snow was bright, sharp, and clean. He was living in a box full of smoke, and he was tired of it. This darkness, he thought, wasn't a force of nature he had to endure. It was a problem of physics. And he, Josiah Calloway, was a man who solved problems. The way everyone built and lived was dictated by the tools they had, and in the 1820s Ohio Valley, the tools for light were ancient and inefficient. The Betty lamp, or its slightly more refined cousin, the Cruzy lamp, was the standard. It was a design that had not fundamentally changed in 1,000 years. It was, at its heart, a pan for burning grease. Josiah himself had made dozens of them. He had hammered the sheet tin, folded the seams, soldered them with lead, and formed the shallow trough for the wick. He had sold them at the settlement store, and every time he sold one, he felt a small pang of guilt, as if he were selling a man a shovel with a cracked handle. He knew it was a poor tool for the job. The common wisdom was that the problem was the fuel, Bear grease was smoky, tallow was better but congealed quickly, and lard was a compromise. The finest, clearest whale oil was a dream, a costly luxury brought by wagon from Philadelphia, far too dear for a frontier tinsmith. So people accepted the smoke, they accepted the smell, they accepted eyes that stung and lungs that coughed. They accepted that in winter life effectively ended at sundown. They trimmed or picked their wicks constantly, pulling the charred crust off to coax a brighter, cleaner flame for a few minutes before the soot built up again. Josiah's first attempts at a solution were, naturally, focused on improving the standard design. He was a craftsman, and he trusted his craft. "If the wick is the problem," he mused to Ilara one evening, "I will make a better wick." He spent a week experimenting. He braided cotton strands into a tight, dense cord. This burned better, drawing the oil more consistently, but it still smoked. He tried weaving a flat ribbon of wick, borrowing an idea from the new whale oil lamps he'd only read about. He built a new lamp body, soldering a thin, flat slot for this new wick. The flame was wider, yes. It was a wall of yellow light instead of a teardrop, but it was just as smoky. It produced, in fact, more smoke, a great, rolling sheet of it that blackened a patch on his ceiling in a single evening. He was disheartened. He had used precious tin and more precious time only to create a more efficient smoke generator. His neighbor, Silas Croft, a man who believed innovation was a form of vanity, had laughed. "Just needs more picking, Calloway. You're trying to outsmart a simple flame, and a flame's got no patience for smarts." Josiah retreated, frustrated. He sat by his hearth watching the fire. His chimney, he knew, was a good one. He had built it himself, with a proper smoke shelf and a tall, straight flue. He lit a twist of paper and held it in the fireplace opening. The flame and smoke were sucked upward, an invisible river of air pulling them. The fire in his hearth burned clean and hot because it had a draught. It was breathing. He looked back at his smoky, sputtering lamp on the table. It was a lazy, open flame, smothered by its own fumes. It wasn't breathing. It was drowning. He realized his mistake. He had been focused on the fuel, the wick, and the container, the lamp body. He had ignored the third vital ingredient, the air. The fire wasn't just on the wick. It was the wick, the fuel, and the air, all in combination, and his design was terrible at combining them. He had been trying to build a better pan. He needed to build a better engine. The breakthrough did not come from a book. The few books Josiah owned were an almanac, a Bible, and a well-worn copy of The American Practical Brewer and Tanner. The knowledge he needed came instead from two different sources, the chimney of his own cabin and a man who understood air as a mechanism. In the spring of 1823, a traveling tinker named Mr. Anselm passed through the settlement. Anselm was Swiss, a man with pale blue eyes and fingers as delicate as a surgeon's, though they were stained with flux and grease. He was by trade a clockmaker, but on the frontier he was a mender of all things metal and mechanical. He was drawn to Josiah's workshop by the sound of precise, rhythmic hammering. He watched Josiah work for a time, then shared his cold provisions. Josiah, hungry for conversation with another craftsman, showed him his problem. He laid out his failed lamp prototypes on the bench, the braided wicks, the flat wick burner, the tall congealed reservoirs. Anselm examined them, his head tilted. He said nothing for a long time. "You see the fire as the enemy of the oil, Mr. Calloway," Anselm finally said, his voice soft, his accent a precise melody. "You are trying to control It. He picked up the flat wick burner. You make the wick wider, but the air is still lazy. It comes only from the side. The flame builds a house of its own smoke, and then it sits inside and suffocates. Josiah felt a jolt of recognition. Drowning. So it needs more air, Josiah said. A bellows? Anselm shook his head. A bellows is force. This is a problem of flow. You must not push the air. You must invite it. He took a piece of charcoal from the hearth and drew on a clean pine shingle. He did not draw a lamp. He drew a cross-section of a furnace, with arrows showing the air's path. The fire breathes, Anselm said, echoing Josiah's own thought, but you are letting it breathe from its mouth. Where its own smoke comes out, it must breathe from below. It must breathe from the inside. He sketched a new shape. It was a wick, but it was a tube. Imagine, he said, a hollow wick. Air comes from below, up through the center. The flame becomes a ring of fire. It has air on the outside and air on the inside. It is surrounded. It has nowhere to hide. It must burn everything. Josiah stared at the drawing. A hollow wick. How could he possibly weave such a thing? It is too complex, Josiah said. I am a tinsmith, not a weaver. So build it, Anselm replied, tapping the charcoal. 2 tubes of tin, one inside the other, the space between. That is your wick. You fill it with cotton, with simple string. A central draught. It was brilliant. It was elegant. But the flame will still be wild, Josiah pressed. A draught in the cabin. Ah, Anselm said, his eyes lighting up. Then you must tame it. You give the flame a corral, but a glass one, a small, tall chimney, like your hearth. He pointed up. The heat from the flame rises, and this glass chimney, it makes the heat rise faster. It creates a wind, a draw, just like your fireplace. It pulls the air through the hollow wick. It becomes a self-feeding engine. A glass chimney, a central draught. Josiah's mind was on fire. He saw it, a complete system. He had no glass chimney, but he had a few precious sheets of glass he'd been saving for a window. He could build the rest from tin. He offered Anselm half his stock of solder in thanks. The Swiss tinker just nodded, packed his things, and moved on, leaving behind an idea that would change the valley. For the next several weeks, Josiah Calloway was a man obsessed. He did not just plan, he sequenced. He saw the lamp in his mind, every part, every soldered joint, every path for the air and the fuel. He spent his evenings not in the dark, but at his workbench, lit by the same smoky Betty lamp, sketching on shingles with charcoal, measuring and calculating. His tools, his precious tin snips, his mallets, and his soldering irons were laid out with the jeweler's precision. This was not pot-mending. This was creation. He listed the problems one by one. First, the burner. This was the heart. He needed 2 concentric cylinders, perfectly round, with a uniform tiny gap. He carved a hardwood dowel to the exact inner diameter. He would form his inner tin tube around this. Then he carved a larger dowel for the outer tube. The gap would be barely a 1/16 of an inch, just wide enough to pack with raw cotton fibers. This entire assembly, the burner, would have to be suspended, held by legs of tin so that air could get underneath it and flow up the central tube. Second, the chimney. He had no way to blow a glass tube, and Anselm was long gone. He looked at his 2 precious flat panes of window glass. He would have to cut them. He had never cut glass. He spent a day practicing on a broken bottle, using a hardened steel file to score a line, then tapping it. The shards were sharp, the breaks unpredictable. He could not make a cylinder, but he was a tinsmith. He could make a frame. He decided to build a square chimney, 4 small panes of glass held in a delicate tin framework, open at both ends. It was heavier, less elegant than a tube, but it was buildable. It would contain the heat and create the draft. Third, the fuel. Anselm had warned him. This new, hot-burning lamp would not be happy with thick, dirty lard. It would clog the narrow wick. He would need a cleaner fuel. He took his entire store of tallow and rendered it twice, straining it through muslin, skimming the clear, liquid fat from the top. He created a small keg of what was, essentially, premium frontier fuel. The constraints were enormous. The tin was meant for roof flashing. The glass was for a window he desperately needed. The tallow was food. Ilara watched him, her face a mask of supportive skepticism. "It is a lot of work, Josiah," she said one night, "for a little light." "It is not a little light, Ilara," he replied, not looking up from his soldering. "It is the right light. It is the light we are owed." His neighbors thought he was mad. Silas Croft saw him practicing cutting glass and declared he'd gone to building useless contraptions. But Josiah ignored them. He was not driven by their approval. He was driven by a vision of a clean, white flame, a flame that obeyed the laws of physics he was only just beginning to understand. He laid his finest sheet of tin on the bench, took a deep breath, and made the first perfect screaming cut with his snips. The work had begun. The construction was an act of faith, a translation of pure theory into hard metal. Josiah began with the burner, the intricate heart of the machine. He formed the inner tube, his mallet tapping lightly on the tin as he wrapped it around the hardwood dowel. He soldered the seam, his hot iron hissing, the lead flowing like silver blood. He did the same for the outer tube. The fit was critical. He spent an entire day filing and fitting the 2 tubes until they nested perfectly, the gap between them uniform and precise. He then, with the patience of a saint, began packing that gap. He used a thin, wire-like pick, teasing individual strands of cotton from a ball of batting, pushing them down into the narrow channel. It took 4 hours to fill the 1-inch height of the burner. This, he knew, was his tubular wick. He then soldered the 3 legs to the bottom, raising the burner assembly to create the vital air intake. He built the font, the fuel reservoir next. He made it wide and flat, not tall, so the fuel level would not drop quickly, ensuring a constant, steady supply to the wick. He soldered it to the burner assembly, his hands steady, his breath held. Then came the chimney. His plan for a square-framed chimney was his greatest test. He cut the tin for the frame, thin, U-shaped channels. He painstakingly scored his precious glass panes. The first one cracked, a spiderweb of failure spreading from the scoreline. He cursed, a rare, sharp sound in the quiet workshop. He had 1 pane left and the shards of the broken one. He would not be defeated. He modified the design, a 3-sided chimney, with the 4th side being a solid sheet of polished tin to act as a reflector. He worked by the light of the smoky Betty lamp, his face inches from the delicate work. He laid the glass into the tin channels, folded the tabs, and flowed solder into the joints. It was clumsy, a box of glass and tin, but it was airtight where it needed to be, and open top and bottom. Finally, he built the rack and pinion. He was a tinsmith, not a clockmaker, but he understood gears. He cut a small, toothed rack from a strip of tin and a tiny pinion gear which he attached to a small knob. This mechanism engaged the side of the wick holder, allowing him to raise or lower the flame. When he was finished, it sat on his bench, a strange, angular, metallic creature. It looked nothing like a lamp. It looked, as Silas later remarked, like a magic lantern that got into a fight with a mousetrap. It was heavy, it was made of tin and solder and scavenged glass, and it was the most beautiful thing Josiah Calloway had ever made. He filled the font with his double-rendered tallow. He trimmed the cotton wick, his shears clicking. He set the strange three-sided chimney over the burner. Ilara and the children gathered around. The cabin was dark, the Betty lamp making its usual pool of smoky gloom on the far side of the room. "Please, Josiah," Ilara whispered, "light it." His hand trembled as he struck a flint. The moment of the test arrived on a frigid December night. A blizzard had descended on the valley, a howling horizontal assault of snow and ice. The wind shrieked in the chimney, and the cabin was plunged into a deep afternoon twilight by 3 p.m. It was the kind of night that exposed every flaw, every drafty crack, every weak point. It was the perfect proving ground. The family was gathered, Ilara's knitting idle in her lap. Josiah set his creation on the center of the heavy oak table. He had filled the font. The clean, pale tallow oil was visible in the small filler hole. He took a long, thin splinter from the hearth, lit it in the fire, and touched it to the top of the tubular wick. The cotton caught. A huge, oily, yellow flame erupted from the burner, climbing 3, 4, 5 inches high. It was a disaster. A column of thick, black, greasy smoke poured from the top of the flame, as if he had lit a tar barrel. It was worse than the Betty lamp. Far worse. He heard Ilara's sharp intake of breath. The children coughed. "It's just a bigger smoke maker," Josiah whispered, his face falling. The weeks of work turning to ash in his mouth. "The chimney," Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. "You forgot the glass. Anselm said it needed the corral." Of course, the draft, the engine. His hand was shaking now, not from fear, but from a sudden, terrible hope. He picked up the heavy, three-sided glass and tin chimney. The tin reflector side was already hot from the radiant heat. He carefully, steadily, lowered it over the burner, fitting it into the small tin fingers he had built to hold it. The effect was not gradual, it was instantaneous. The second the chimney settled, the lazy, smoky, yellow flame leaped upwards, as if grabbed by an invisible hand. It constricted, sucked into a new shape. The color changed. The lazy orange-yellow was consumed, replaced by a brilliant, fierce white light. The smoke did not lessen, it vanished. It was being eaten. The sound changed too. The sputtering of the open flame was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady, internal roar, the sound of the draft, the stack effect pulling air through the central tube at high speed. The cabin was flooded with light. It was not the weak, yellow circle of the Betty lamp. It was a stark, clear, shadow-cutting brilliance. Josiah looked at Ilara. He could see the individual threads in her shawl. He could see the color of her eyes, a deep hazel he usually only saw in daylight. The children scrambled over, their faces pale and awestruck in the intense light. It's like daylight, Pa," his son whispered. Josiah walked to the far corner of the cabin, a full 15 feet away, and held up his almanac. He could read the smallest print. He looked at the ceiling above the lamp. not a wisp of smoke. He looked at the reflector. It was casting a huge, bright rectangle of light onto the wall, doubling the lamp's effectiveness. He then walked over and, with a single puff of breath, extinguished the Betty lamp. The room barely dimmed. The Callaway lamp, as it would come to be known, burned on, a silent, white, steady pillar of fire, holding the blizzard and the darkness at bay. They sat for 3 hours, reading, sewing and talking, the children playing with shadow puppets on the wall. When Josiah finally checked the fuel level, his heart leaped. It had used, by his estimation, half the oil the Betty lamp would have consumed to produce 1/4 of the smoke and 1/10 of the light. It was not just an improvement, it was a revolution. The revolution began, as it often does, with a neighbor's envy. Silas Croft, hearing the rumors and seeing the impossible, bright white square of light in the Callaway's window during the blizzard, came by the next day. He stood in the workshop examining the lamp. He was no longer laughing. "Callaway," he said, clearing his throat, "I've got a side of cured bacon, a good one, 20 pounds easy. I'd trade it for one of them." By the end of the month, Josiah had orders from every family in the settlement. By spring, his workshop was no longer a side business for mending pots. It was a full-time manufactory for the Callaway Center Draft lamp. He was no longer just a tinsmith, he was the valley's illuminator. The design evolved. Word of his lamp traveled down the river to Cincinnati, and a merchant, seeing an opportunity, offered to trade him a full crate of proper blown-glass cylindrical chimneys for 12 lamps. Josiah agreed. The clumsy, 3-sided chimneys were set aside. The new clear glass tubes were lighter, more elegant, and created an even more perfect, more powerful draft. He perfected the rack and pinion window, making it smoother. He created a wider, more stable safety font that was harder to tip over. The impact on the settlement was profound and immediate. It was a revolution in time. The winter nights were no longer a void. The general store, lit by 2 of Josiah's lamps, now stayed open 2 hours past sundown, becoming a center for community, not just commerce. Women in the sewing circle found they could work with black thread on dark wool, a task previously impossible. Men repaired harnesses, carved tool handles, and read newspapers at night, by a light that did not poison the air they breathed. Children's literacy, the schoolmaster noted, improved dramatically. They were getting in an extra hour of reading every single night. The dark, greasy film of soot that had been a permanent feature of frontier life began to fade. Cabins were cleaner, lungs clearer. The Callaway lamp pushed back the dark, and in doing so, gave the community its evenings back. Years later, by the 1840s, his design had been copied and modified by tinsmiths in 12 other settlements. It was rarely called the Callaway lamp anymore. It was simply the center draft or the chimney lamp. When the new coal oil, kerosene, arrived in the 1850s, the principles of his burner were adapted perfectly. Josiah's frontier innovation, born of frustration and tin snips, had laid the groundwork for the lamps that would light rural America for the next century. Josiah Callaway had not invented the principles of physics he employed, but he had discovered them as surely as if he were the first. His lamp worked because it was not just a container, but a system for combustion. A machine that turned a complex problem into an elegant, continuous process. The smoky yellow flame of the Betty lamp was a sign of failure, the failure of complete combustion. The fuel was being heated, turning into vapor, but it was not mixing with enough oxygen to burn. Instead, the intense heat broke the vapor down into elemental carbon, soot, which then rose, heated to a dull orange glow, creating the weak, smoky light. It was an engine running on a choked-off air supply, wasting most of its fuel. The Callaway lamp, in its rustic genius, solved this. It was, in effect, a miniature controlled furnace. The key was the central draft, the principle that the Swiss tinker Anselm had understood. By making the wick a tube, air could be drawn up through the middle. The flame was attacked by oxygen from all sides, from the outside air and from the column of air rushing up the central tube. This 360-degree supply of oxygen meant the fuel vapors were burned completely and instantly. There was no time for them to decompose into soot. The energy that had previously been wasted making smoke was now released as light, a clean, white and brilliant light. The second piece of genius was the glass chimney. It was not just a windbreak, it was the engine of the draft. The hot air and exhaust from the flame, trapped inside the chimney, rose with incredible speed. This created a powerful vacuum at the base, the stack effect, which in turn pulled a fast, steady and constant stream of fresh air through the central draft tube. The Callaway lamp did not just invite the air, as Anselm had suggested, it commanded it. It was a perfectly balanced, self-sustaining system. Josiah, with no formal training, had intuitively grasped the principles of fluid dynamics and thermodynamics. He had built a high-efficiency engine from tin, glass and cotton, proving that the frontier was not just a place of brute force, but a crucible for profound, practical innovation. The same principles he harnessed in 1823 are still used in the most advanced combustion engines today. Josiah Callaway lived long enough to see his grandchildren learn to read by the bright white light of a mass-produced kerosene lamp, its design a direct, if unacknowledged, descendant of the one he had built with a pickling jar and a sheet of tin. He never became a rich man. He never filed a patent. He remained the valley's tinsmith, a man respected for his steady hand, his fair dealings, and the clear light lamps that had long since become the standard. The original prototype, the clumsy, three-sided model, sat on his mantelpiece, a quiet, metallic testament to the night of the blizzard. His innovation was not one of grand monuments or thundering machines. It was an innovation of hours. The hours he gave back to families, the eye strain he prevented, the books that could be read, the stitches that could be sewn. It was the quiet, uncelebrated heroism of good design. He had learned in those long nights of work that darkness was not an enemy to be fought, but a problem to be solved. It was a symptom of waste, a sign that a system was out of balance. The smoke, he often told his son, the smoke is the lesson. Where there is smoke, there is inefficiency. Where there is waste, there is an opportunity for a better design. This was the principle he left behind, a legacy more durable than tin. Do not just accept the way things are done, especially when they fill the room with smoke. Look for the waste. Question the assumptions. Understand that the most powerful solutions often come not from adding more force, but from creating a better path. Tending to the small, unglamorous details of how air flows, how fuel is spent, and how a flame truly breathes is not just craft. It is the work of civilization. It is how you build a life and a future out of the raw and unforgiving dark.